Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the GForce Oberheim OBX tutorial. Today we're going to have a look at some of the advanced features of this synthesizer. I've already covered in part one of this little mini series the basic functionality of the synth. Today we're going to dive into some of the more complex areas, and we're going to start out by having a look at two options in the oscillator section that we didn't touch on at all in the last episode. We're going to deal with cross modulation first, which is the X-Mod button. Just a quick note to say, I've initialized the sound. We've got a completely simple sawtooth wave here. Now I'm going to engage the cross mod feature. Just bear in mind, this synth actually has two things called cross mod. The X-Mod button deals with basically connecting these two oscillators together. We're going to hear that in a moment. There's also a cross modulation section. This entire panel in the top left-hand synth is called the cross modulation section, not to be confused with the cross mod function. Okay, this is what cross mod sounds like. As you can see in the oscilloscope and here, it's a much more complex sound than the simple sawtooth that we just started off with. When we engage cross mod, oscillator 2 is modulating the pitch of oscillator 1 at its own audible frequency. In other words, oscillator 2 is applying FM frequency modulation to oscillator 1. Now, the reason why it sounds so odd is because oscillator 2, if I just turn it up, is cycling 131 times a second. So just think about that, 131 times a second, oscillator 2 is varying or modulating the pitch of oscillator 1. That means that when cross mod is enabled and we're only listening to oscillator 2, it basically has nothing to do. This is an operation exclusively applied to oscillator 1. In this context, oscillator 1 is called a carrier and oscillator 2 is the modulator. So let's go back to the point where we can hear the sound. Now I'm going to prove to you that that really is frequency modulation and it's oscillator 2 that's doing it. I'm just going to disengage cross mod and drop the fundamental pitch of the oscillator down as far as I can. Pull the tuning all the way down, transpose it down an octave, play the same key. It's now cycling at 32 Hertz. I'm going to drop it down an octave again. So it's now cycling 16 times a second. That click that you're hearing is actually a control voltage click, because this is a sawtooth that you're hearing. So 16 times a second, the control voltage is resetting and you're actually hearing that as a sound. If I turn into triangle mode, it'll be almost silent. So that's just a very low throbbing hum, cycling at 16 Hertz. At the moment, oscillator 2 is cycling at exactly the same speed. So if I now engage cross modulation, we should be able to hear that pitch modulation because it's now sufficiently slow for us to just about be able to catch it. And there it is. Let's put oscillator 2 in triangle mode as well. And there it is. So that's oscillator 2 modulating the pitch of oscillator 1. What did I say? 16 times a second? So now I've brought oscillator 1 back up into some sort of audible, like more sensible frequency range. Oscillator 2 is still cycling 16 times a second. And eventually, around 30 to 40 Hertz, we lose the ability to discriminate any individual cycle. It turns into a different sound. We call it FM, but really it's just very fast oscillation of a modulator. And very cool it is too. Let's throw all that away. And now we'll have a look at sync mode. So in sync mode, oscillator 2 is the interesting oscillator. In cross mod, oscillator 1 is the one that you're really concentrating on. When we engage sync mode, oscillator 2 is synced to oscillator 1. Oscillator 2 becomes the slave and oscillator 1 is the master. These are terms that are very common in analog synthesis, so I'm introducing you to them so that you're kind of familiar with them if you come across them in different contexts. Now, as I've said, in sync mode, oscillator 1 is not an interesting oscillator at all. It sounds exactly the same on and off. If I mute oscillator 1, however, and listen to oscillator 2 instead, initially it'll still sound the same. What I'm going to do now, however, is increase the frequency of oscillator 2. We're listening to oscillator 2, so you expect to hear a pitch change, but you're not going to. What you can see in the oscilloscope there is an illustration of sync in operation. What's happening is that I've now sped up oscillator 2. It's cycling faster than oscillator 1. Every time oscillator 1 finishes one period of its wave, whatever speed, whatever frequency it's cycling at, every time it finishes its oscillation, it sends an instruction to oscillator 2 to start redrawing its wave. And you can see it in the oscilloscope. Just reduce the volume. This bump, this sharp notch here, is where oscillator 2 has drawn one complete wave and part of wave number 2. Oscillator 1 comes along at this point here, it says reset, and it begins redrawing its wave. If I zoom out a little bit, I'll just increase the pitch actually. There we go. So now you can see it happening more obviously. Every time I increase the frequency of oscillator 2, it's going to get further along drawing that second wave, and you'll see the notch get deeper. So now it's drawing kind of 1.5 waves, there or thereabouts. The important thing is that you get this really interesting tonal effect. Synced oscillators have a very unique characteristic, and pretty much ever since the beginning of the 1970s, when it was discovered how cool this sound was, most analog synthesizers implemented sync, and the OBX was no different. So it has quite a sharp sort of nasal sound. It's a very idiosyncratic sound, and it's all to do with this unique wave shape. Next thing for us to have a look at today is macros. Bottom right hand corner of the synthesizer, we've got these 4 controls labeled macro 1 to 4. To help me deal with macros, I'm going to load up a preset, and it's called an active aggression. Let's load that up, because it uses all 4 macros in a quite nice illustrative way. Now when you first load up a preset, can you see all of these green knobs? They went out then. The macro controls are on a kind of time delay. Every time you select one of them, if I select macro 1, you get a brief illustration across the synthesizer of the user interface components that are assigned to macro 1. And can you see these 3 green lights? They correspond to this number 3 in the control panel, and this is telling you that macro 1 is assigned to 3 different controls. So when the green light goes out, you've got that kind of quick visual clue. If I click in the number box, we get a little pop-up menu telling you what those assignments are. So we've got modulation depth 1, which is this control over here. Here's mod depth 2, which is this control. Just bring them back again. And finally, output gain, which is a negative modulation over here. And these little green marks around the outside of the control correspond to these percentages. What this allows us to do is assign multiple different modulation controls to a single knob. So this macro knob, macro number 1, is going to affect 3 different controls simultaneously when I turn it up. So let's have a think about what that's going to sound like. Well, this is the LFO section, so everything is going to be oscillating in some respect. We're going to apply low frequency oscillation to the filter. You're going to hear that as a kind of modulating filter sweep. We've also got modulation being applied to the volume, which is going to transmit into tremolo. And then the third effect is volume. So why are we pulling the volume down? Well, it's because we're increasing the filter. Whoever designed this preset decided that when that filter sweep is spiking up into the higher frequencies, maybe it sounds a little bit louder, and we're just pulling away, trimming off a little 10% off the output gain. So let's have a listen to all 3 of those controls, all 3 of those modulations happening simultaneously when I turn this single knob. So you can hear the filter and the tremolo simultaneously. They're both cycling at the same speed. The low frequency oscillator is assigned to both of those destinations simultaneously. And a little bit more subtly, this one's difficult to notice, we're just pulling a little bit of the volume down to account for the fact that all of these extra frequencies have been introduced. The more I turn up that macro control, the intensity of all of those effects accelerates, because this green zone tells you the whole range over which the macro control operates. Let's have a look at another one. I'm cunningly going to avoid macro 2 at the moment because that's the most complicated one. Let's have a look at macro 3. We already know it's only assigned to a single destination. Let's see what it is. I'll just click the control, and there we go. It's the voice settings detune. If we select the pop-up menu instead, we can now see that detune spread is set to 46%. So this is a unison sound. 8 voices are being thrown into this single key. Every time I press a note, you're hearing 8 different voices. By increasing the detune, we offset the pitches of all of those 8 voices and the sound thickens. So from the detune control itself, it sounds like that. Exactly the same effect when we apply the macro. But of course the macro has a different range. Its minimum to maximum is only actually operating over 46% of the entire control. So all that's been done there really, if you're thinking, well, why is macro 3 being assigned to the detune control in the first place? It just lets you basically hammer away on that control. You can't possibly go past the point where the preset designer thought, well, I don't want you to go past 46%. It sounds too detuned at that point. So it's kind of like a safety net, safe control that you can't really go wrong with it. What's macro 4 doing? Let's click the control. A couple of assignments to the high pass filter and the feedback in the delay. And we can see that they're both positive. So when I turn this control up, we're going to get more feedback on the delay, which means it's going to last for longer. But I'm also increasing the high pass filter, which means I'm throwing away low frequencies on the delay echoes. This is a very common effect. If you don't trim away some low end from delay, it can very often get muddy because all of that low frequency is the most energetic of the audio spectrum, that they all kind of stack on top of each other and the sound gets duller and duller and kind of more unpleasant. Very common to trim away low frequencies from delay bounce. So let's just hear the sound on its own, a very brief staccato note. Now we'll pull up macro 4. It's lasting longer and it's getting thinner. Those bounces are basically truncating that low frequency. Now I'm going to use macro 4 to demonstrate how to assign macros, because the one control that we haven't looked at yet is this big plus symbol. It's incredibly easy. You pick up the plus symbol and you drag it onto the control that you want to assign a new destination to. So now this macro 4 control is mapped to 3 things and resonance is one of them. At the moment it's not doing anything because filter resonance is set to 0%. But with the macro selected, when these green knobs are highlighted, if I right click, I'm going to right click with my mouse and now increase the knob, and now you can see the green zone expanding. So now when I turn up macro 4, in addition to me getting that extra delay, I'm also going to increase the filter resonance. And you can hear that resonant peak spiking out. Okay then, why have I left macro 2 till last? Well, firstly, let's click on it. Seems innocent enough, it's just assigned to the oscillator frequency, isn't it? Well, yes and no. It's telling a much more complex story than that. Let's have a look at what it's actually assigned to. And we'll deal with oscillator 2 frequency first. Ignore the other two, we will get to them in a moment. Oscillator 2 frequency. Is this going to change the pitch of oscillator 2? No, it's a synced sound. As we've just seen, a synced sound means that oscillator 2 is effectively a filter control. It's not a pitch control. So whenever you see anything, any modulation source assigned to an oscillator frequency, just have a quick glance to see if there's a sync control out there, because it's very possible that this is actually a tonal effect, and that's what's happening here. Let's demonstrate that quickly, just without the macro control. I'm going to change the frequency of oscillator 2 with the note held down, and we'll listen to that filtered sound. And it was set to 25. This is another very common thing that you'll see. It's very unusual when you've got oscillators synced together that they're multiples of the octave. So you won't get 0, 12, 24, 36, because that's really subverting the point of sync. The whole idea is that you want these oscillators cycling at different fundamental speeds, and all multiples of an octave just aren't that. At the multiples of the octaves, the oscillators fit neatly into each other, and so you don't really get the effect of sync. We've chosen 25 here, perfectly reasonable number. So that's what the first macro assignment is doing. It's allowing me to variably modulate the frequency of oscillator 2, turning into a tonal control. But what on earth is going on with these other two controls? Oscillator 2 frequency LFO amount? That doesn't make any sense until we look at the final module that we haven't seen yet. This is the Cross Modulation module. In order for us to see what these two controls are doing, the first thing that I'm going to do is make sure that oscillator frequency is selected. So this is the currently focused control. Have a look up in the Cross Modulation section. Can you see oscillator 2 frequency is highlighted twice? That's going to matter. Now I'm going to click the macro control again. We didn't see this before, but these two controls are now lit green. So these are macro destinations 2 and 3 that had previously been hidden from us. If you ever see a number in any of the macro controls and you click on the knob and you can't see that many coloured controls in the interface, just bear in mind that you've also got cross modulation, and that's exactly what's happening here. Now we're going to take a circuitous route to actually explain these two functions because there's an awful lot bundled into this macro control, and I want to describe the cross modulator in theory before we get to the actual practice of what's going on. So we're going to come back to macro 2 a little bit later, don't worry about it. Just for now, I'm going to jump over to a different control. I'm not going to select the volume knob and then just ask you to look at the synthesizer for a moment. Does anything look odd at any of the controls in this synthesizer as you kind of step back and look at it from a wide angle? How many of those controls would you say look unusual? The answer is 3, and it's an aspect of the interface that might pass you by until your attention is drawn to it. But the oscillator frequency, filter cutoff, and voice settings detune all have red halos around them that none of the other controls do. That's telling you that those controls are interacting with the cross modulator. And the first demonstration that I'm going to give to you is the filter control. I'll just also say the filter control is a deeper red halo than the other two. We're going to come to that in a moment. Let's click it. And now, as soon as I did, something happened in the cross modulator. Firstly, that we've got two labels, both saying filter frequency. That's the knob I just clicked. But also we saw some sliders change. I'll click out of it. This is the default appearance of the cross modulator. Any control that isn't assigned to it, cross modulator is going to look like that. To any control that is assigned, we see changes of the settings. So this cross modulator basically contains two separate components, a low frequency oscillator, which is on the left hand side, and an envelope on the right hand side. We've got some copy and paste buttons in the middle, which are really obvious. I'll give you a quick demo of those in a moment. But for now, I just want you to concentrate on this envelope. Now, we've already looked at the concept of envelopes when we looked at filters and loudness, and we described this attack, decay, sustain, release process. Over time, we draw this shape and then we apply that shape to some destination in the system. Well, the cross modulator has a low frequency oscillator and envelope assignable to almost every control that you can see in this synthesizer. So in this case, the filter cutoff has been assigned some extra things, some extra modulation settings from the cross mod module. But just bear in mind how much more complex, how much deeper that makes this synthesizer simply by adding this one module on. You've got potentially 50 or 60 extra modulation sources that can be applied to different parts of the system. Now, in the case of the filter cutoff, only one of the two components is being used, the envelope. The most important control as far as the envelope is concerned is the amplitude knob. This knob here specifies how much this envelope is going to affect this control. If I double click the amplitude, watch that halo. Okay, so there's no longer any envelope being applied. Let's listen to the sound as it stands without any envelope modulation. Now I'm going to reintroduce this envelope modulation. I'm going to really crank it up. Okay, did you hear the sound get brighter over a period of time and then get duller and then come back to the point where as if there was no envelope being applied there at all? Let's restore the sound to its default state by throwing it away and loading it up again. Here's our amplitude at 52%. Let's have a look at what the envelope's actually doing. it's spending 1.5 seconds on its attack phase. So we're going to start off at our native cutoff level, whatever this is, and then for 1.5 seconds the sound is going to get brighter. Then we have a decay phase of 2 seconds, we're going to come down. Where are we going to come down to? Well, we're not necessarily going to come down to the point that we started from. The next control, called slope start, defines where we decay down to, and at 0% we do basically finish off where we started. If I pull that down, however, we're going to go through our regular point and we're going to basically turn that LFO down, basically like pulling the cutoff control down. Let's hear that. And then you heard it snap back after the decay phase had finished and we'd gone deeper and deeper and thrown almost all of the frequencies away. We snapped back to our standard point. That's because that's what the slope time determines. The slope time says how fast do we get from the slope start to the slope end. So if I increase slope time, so let's say 2 seconds, let's hear it now. Up, down, and back up again. And then we settle down to the natural sound. So it's quite a complex envelope. These extra slope start and slope time components allow you to basically overlay this mask, this envelope mask, on top of everything else that's happening in the synthesizer. And the amplitude knob determines how much of all of this is going to happen. We also have a velocity control here. If I turn that up, it just means however hard I hit the key, it's going to have a different effect on the envelope. That's not the case in this preset. Let's throw all of that away and get back again. 2 other cross modulation controls in this synth. Let's have a look at the detune next. What's it doing? Well, when I select the control, you can see that detune spread has a very slight amplitude level of 17%, which means that we're applying an envelope, once again spending 1.5 seconds going up, 2.3 seconds coming back down, and that's being applied to the detune. Let's give it more of that and hear that effect, really dramatic. Yep, pretty obvious what's going on there. Throw that away and come back again. Now the third control, once again, the poor old oscillator frequency, which is being beleaguered from all sorts of different angles, is being modulated by the cross mod module, but this time not by the envelope. You see the amplitude is set to 0%. As I said earlier, the cross mod module has 2 separate components, and in this particular case, it's the low frequency oscillator that's modulating oscillator frequency. Once again, stick the same asterisk on. It's going to be a tonal effect, not a pitch-based effect, because of our sync. So let's have a look at the low frequency oscillator. What's it doing? Well, it's currently in sine wave mode, got 10 different shapes, pretty self-explanatory. The amount control over here, which is set to 24.5%, is basically the same as the amplitude control in the envelope. And here you can see we have 24.5% of this oscillator being mapped into the frequency control. So we're basically going to turn that frequency knob up and down periodically using the cross LFO. Let's dial more of it in and listen to the effect. That really slow sweep, almost kind of like a flanger. The rate of that sweep is being determined by the time control, 4.3 seconds. Let's throw that preset away, get back to it as it comes out of the box. And finally, we're in a position to understand macro 2, because now that we understand the amount and time are basically the depth and the rate of the oscillator that's being applied to this frequency control, when we jump over to macro 2 and we see that those 2 controls, LFO amount and rate, have positive modulation from the macro knob. When I turn up this macro knob, in addition to me turning the knob up itself, oscillator 2 frequency is being explicitly modulated. I'm also increasing the depth of the LFO that's being applied to the same control and slowing it down. When I turn up this time slider, this is a time slider by the way, not a rate slider. So as I increase the time, I'm making the LFO get slower. Let's have a listen to that. So what I virtually did there is I turned up this control, and this one, and this one. And that's the sound I ended up with simply by turning a single macro control. And that's why I chose this particular preset, because it's an excellent illustration of both the concept of macros and the concept of cross modulation, and mapping those two things together with a single control. Bear in mind that you've got these two layers, these two kind of visual layers that are complementary, but sometimes you can't see them both simultaneously. I'll throw the preset away and come back to it one last time. When you first dial it in, everything that's got a macro assigned to it is green. But if I select a control, let's say the tuner over here, which doesn't have any mappings to it, when I click the macro knob, you don't see all three green controls, you only see one of them. If I click the frequency knob, then I'm now seeing the cross modulation section for it, but they're not green. It's only when you click the macro control that you can see in that context, in the context of the currently selected control, what are the macro settings assigned to that control. And finally, I said I'd give you a very quick demonstration of copy, paste and clear. This is super obvious. Let's say I've got the cutoff knob selected. Here's the envelope settings for the cutoff control. I can copy them, select the resonance control, click paste, and I've basically just sent all of those cross mod settings into the resonance knob, and now you can see the red halo highlighted. One final thing for me to demo today, and it's something from episode 1 where I said I'll try to remember to come back to this. It's a very small thing, but I said I would, so I will. I'm going to dial up Not in Any Rush and close that down. This is a sound in legato voice mode. So what this basically means is all of the envelopes in the OBX usually trigger every time you press a key. But if you're in legato mode, they don't. When you press the first key, that fires all of the envelopes. Subsequent keys don't. So there's all of the envelopes for this sound playing. Now if I hold that note down, you can hear those sounds get increasingly dull because the envelopes aren't firing. If you have an amplitude envelope that's maybe sustaining down to 0, that sound will fade away if you've got something held down. This is classic behavior from the early 70s. The Moogs were very kind of famous for this sort of sound, and Oberheim have picked it up with the OBX. So that's simply the difference between the legato mode and the mono mode, where every key press will trigger the envelopes. And that's us done for this little mini series. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more content like this. Thanks very much. I'll see you later.